Welcome to Sniper's Rest. Sniper's Rest is the last best rest stop in the here and there, the place between where you're coming from and where you're going. Welcome, my friend. I've just been experimenting with a new honey loaf. It's quite nice. I'll toast you some with some butter and a nice cuppa, huh? I am Sniper Shadow, and I reside here in Sniper's Rest as a guide and custodian to those who pass through here. I visit the worlds within the multiverse often, but I am always here to guide and care for the travelers such as yourself that pass through the here and there. Please take a rest before continuing on your journey. Frank's off in the garden with Tina. The girl loves to throw the ball for him, and he greatly enjoys her mad little tea parties. We have an agreement, however, no dynamite in the here and there. But these are not your concern, my friend. Do not worry. We're on the third part of our book now, aren't we? Today, we continue A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Poor Axel gets swept up into his uncle's plan to journey to the very center of the Earth. Last we left, they were just about to get on the train to Copenhagen on the start of their journey to Iceland. Let's see where this wild ride takes us. Chapter 8. Serious Preparations for a Vertical Descent. Altonia, which is but a suburb of Hamburg, is the terminus of the Kiel Railway, which was to carry us to the Belts. In 20 minutes, we were in Holstein. At 6:30, the carriage stopped at the station. My uncle's numerous packages, his voluminous impedimenta, were unloaded, removed, labelled, weighed, and put into the luggage vans, and at 7 we were seated face to face in our compartment. The whistle sounded, the engine started, and we were off. Was I resigned? No, not yet. Yet the cool morning air and the scenes on the road, rapidly changed by the swiftness of the train, drew me away somewhat from my sad reflections. As for the professor's reflections, they went off far in advance of the swiftest express. We were alone in the carriage, but we sat in silence. My uncle examined all his pockets and his travelling bag with the minutest of care. I saw that he had not forgotten the smallest matter of detail. Amongst other documents, a sheet of paper, carefully folded, bore the heading of the Danish Consulate with the signature of W. Christensen, consul at Hamburg and the professor's friend. With this we possessed the proper introductions to the governor of Iceland. I also observed the famous document most carefully laid up in the secret pocket of his portfolio. I bestowed the malediction upon it, and then proceeded to examine the country. It was a very long succession of uninteresting, loamy, fertile flats, a very easy country for the construction of railways, and propitious for the laying down of these direct level lines so dear to railway companies. I had no time to get tired of the monotony, for in 3 hours we stopped at Kiel, close to the sea. The luggage being labelled for Copenhagen, we had no occasion to look after it, yet the professor watched every article with jealous vigilance, until they were all safe on board. There they disappeared in the hold. My uncle, notwithstanding his hurry, had so well calculated the relations between the train and the steamer that we had a whole day to spare. The steamer, Eleonora, did not start until night. Thence sprang a feverish state of excitement, in which the impatient, irascible traveller devoted his perdition to the railway directors and the steamboat companies and the governments which allowed such intolerable slowness. I was obliged to act chorus to him when he attacked the captain of the Eleonora upon this subject. The captain disposed of us summarily. Kiel, as elsewhere, we must do something to while the time away. What with walking on the verdant shores of the bay within which nestles the little town, exploring the thick woods which make it look like a nest embowed amongst thick foliage, admiring the villas, each provided with a little bathing house, and moving about and grumbling, at last 10 o'clock came. The heavy coils of smoke from the Eleanor's funnel unrolled in the sky. The bridge shook with the quivering of the struggling steam. We were on board, and the owners for the time of 2 berths, one over the other, in the only saloon cabin on board. At 1:15 the moorings were loosed, and the throbbing steamer pursued her way over the dark waters of the great belt. The night was dark, and there was a sharp breeze and a rough sea. A few lights appeared on the shore through the thick darkness. Later on, I cannot tell when, a dazzling light from some lighthouse threw a bright stream of fire along the waves, and this is all I can remember of this first portion of our sail. At 7 in the morning we landed at Kosor, a small town on the west coast of Zealand. There we were transferred from the boat to a line of railway, which took us by just as flat country as the plain of Holsten. 3 hours travelling brought us to the capital of Denmark. My uncle had not shut his eyes all night. In his impatience, I believe he was trying to accelerate the train with his feet. At last he discerned a stretch of sea. "The Sound!" he cried. At our left was a huge building that looked like a hospital. "That's a lunatic asylum," said one of our travelling companions. Very good, thought I. Just the place we want to end our days in. And great as it is, that asylum is not big enough to contain all Professor Lidenbrock's madness. At 10 in the morning, at last, we set our feet in Copenhagen. The luggage was put upon a carriage and taken with ourselves to the Phoenix Hotel in Breda Gate. This took half an hour, for the station is out of town. Then my uncle, after a hasty toilet, dragged me after him. The porter at the hotel could speak both German and English, but the professor, as a polyglot, questioned him in good Danish, and it was in the same language that the personage directed him to the Museum of Northern Antiquities. The curator of this curious establishment, in which wonders are gathered together out of which the ancient history of the country might be reconstituted by means of its stone weapons, its cups, and its jewels, was a learned savant, the friend of the Danish consul at Hamburg, Professor Thomasson. My uncle had a cordial letter of introduction to him. As a general rule, one savant greets the other with coolness. But here the case was different. M. Thomasson, like a good friend, gave the Professor Lidenbrock a cordial greeting, and he even vouchsafed the same kindness to his nephew. It is hardly necessary to say the secret was sacredly kept from the excellent curator. We were simply disinterested travellers visiting Iceland out of a harmless curiosity. M. Thomasson placed his services at our disposal, and we visited the quays, with the object of finding out the next vessel to sail. I was yet in hopes that there would be no means of getting to Iceland, but there was no such luck. A small Danish schooner, the Valkyra, was set to sail for Reykjavik on the 2nd of June. Captain M. Bajan was on board. His intending passenger was so joyful that he almost squeezed his hands until they ached. But the good man was rather surprised at his energy. To him it seemed a very simple thing to do to go to Iceland, as that was his business, but to my uncle it was sublime. The worthy captain took advantage of his enthusiasm to charge double fares, but we did not trouble ourselves with mere trifles. "You must be on board on Tuesday at 7 in the morning," said Captain Bijon, after having pocketed more dollars than were his due. Then we thanked M. Thomasson for his kindness, and we returned to the Phoenix Hotel. "It's all right. It's all right," my uncle repeated. "How fortunate we are to have found this boat ready for sailing. Now let us have some breakfast and go about the town." First we went to Kongens Natur, an irregular-shaped square, in which there are 2 innocent-looking guns, which need not alarm anyone. Close by, at number 5, there was a French restaurant, kept by a cook by the name of Vincent, where we had an ample breakfast for 4 marks each. Then I took a childish pleasure in exploring the city. My uncle let me take him with me, but he took notice of nothing, neither the insignificant King's Palace, nor the pretty 17th-century bridge which spans the canal before the museum, nor that immense cenotaph of the Waltons, adorned with horrible mural painting and containing within it a collection of the sculptor's works, nor in a fine park the toy-like chateau of Rosenberg, nor the beautiful Renaissance edifice of the Exchange, nor its spire composed of twisted tails of 4 bronze dragons, nor the great windmill on the ramparts, whose huge arms dilated in the sea breeze like the sails of a ship. What delicious walks we should have had together, my pretty Velandese and I, along the harbour where the 2-deckers, and the frigate sleep peacefully by the red roofing of the warehouse, by the green banks of the strait, through the deep shades of the trees, amongst which the fort is half concealed, where the guns are thrusting out their black throats between the branches of alder and willow. But alas, Graubin was far away, and I never hoped to see her again. But if my uncle felt no attraction towards these romantic scenes, he was very much struck with the aspect of a certain church spire situated in the island of Amak, which forms around the south-west quarter of Copenhagen. I was ordered to direct my feet that way. I embarked on a small steamer which plies on the canals, and in a few minutes she touched the quay of the dockyard. After crossing a few narrow streets, where some convicts in trousers half yellow and half grey were at work under the orders of the gangers, we arrived at Vor-Frelsers Kirk. There was nothing remarkable about the church, but there was a reason why its tall spire had attracted the professor's attention. Starting from the top of the tower, an external staircase wound around the spire, the spirals circling up into the sky. "Let us get to the top," said my uncle. "I shall be dizzy," I said. "The more reason why we should go up. We must get used to it. But, come, I tell you, you don't waste our time." I had to obey. A keeper who lived at the other end of the street handed us the key, and the ascent began. My uncle went ahead with a light step. I followed him, not without alarm, for my head was very apt to feel dizzy. I possessed neither the equilibrium of an eagle nor his fearless nature. As long as we were protected on the inside of the winding staircase up the tower, all was well enough. But after toiling up 150 steps, the fresh air came to salute my face, and we were on the leads of the tower. There the aerial staircase began its gyrations, only guarded by a thin iron rail, and the narrowing steps seemed to ascend into infinite space. "Never shall I be able to do it," I said. "Don't be a coward. Come up, sir," said my uncle with the coldest cruelty. I had to follow, clutching at every step. The keen air made me giddy. I felt the spire rocking with every gust of wind. My knees began to fail. Soon I was crawling on my knees, then creeping on my stomach. I closed my eyes. I seemed to be lost in space. At last I reached the apex, with the assistance of my uncle dragging me up by the collar. "Look down," he cried. "Look down well. You must take a lesson in the abysses." I opened my eyes. I saw houses squashed flat, as if they had all fallen down from the skies. A smoke fog seemed to drown them. Over my head, ragged clouds were drifting past, and by an optical inversion they seemed stationary, while the steeple, the ball, and I were all spinning along with fantastic speed. Far away on one side was the green country, on the other the sea sparkled, bathed in sunlight. The Sound stretched away to Ellesnor, dotted with a few white sails, like seagulls' wings, and in the misty east and away to the northeast lay outstretched the faintly shadowed shores of Sweden. All this immensity of space whirled and wavered, fluctuating beneath my eyes. But I was compelled to rise, to stand up, to look. My first lesson in dizziness lasted an hour. When I got permission to come down and feel the solid street pavements, I was afflicted with a severe lumbago. "Tomorrow we will do it again," said the professor. And it was so. For 5 days in succession I was obliged to undergo this anti-vertiginous exercise, and whether I would or would not, I made some improvement in the art of lofty contemplations. Chapter 9. Iceland. But what next? The day of our departure arrived. The day before it, our kind friend M. Tomlinson brought us letters of introduction to Count Trampe, the governor of Iceland, M. Pitchurison, the Bishop Suffragan, and M. Finsen, mayor of Revignac. My uncle expressed his gratitude by tremendous compressions of both his hands. On the second, at 6 in the evening, all our precious baggage being safely on board the Valkyra, the captain took us into a very narrow cabin. "Is the wind favourable?" my uncle asked. "Excellent," replied Captain Bajan. "A sou'easter. We shall pass down the Sound full speed with all sails set." In a few minutes the schooner, under her mizen, brigantine, topsail, and topgallant sail, loosed from her moorings and made full sail through the straits. In an hour the capital of Denmark seemed to sink below the distant waves, and the Valkyra was skirting along the coast by Ellesnor. In my nervous frame of mind I expected to see the ghost of Hamlet wandering on the legendary castle terrace. "Sublime madman," I said, "no doubt you would approve of our expedition. Perhaps you would keep us company to the centre of the globe to find the solution of your eternal doubts." But there was no ghostly shape upon the ancient walls. Indeed, the castle is much younger than the heroic Prince of Denmark. It now answers the purpose of a sumptuous lodge for the doorkeeper of the Straits of the Sound, before which every year there pass 15,000 ships of all nations. The castle of Kronsberg soon disappeared in the mist, as well as the tower of Hillenburg, built on the Swedish coast, and the schooner passed lightly on her way, urged by the breezes of the Kagat. The Valkyra was a splendid sailor, but on a sailing vessel you can place no dependence. She was taking to Ravignac coal, household goods, earthenware, woolen clothing, and a cargo of wheat. The crew consisted of 5 men, all Danes. "How long will the passage take?" my uncle asked. 10 days, the captain replied, "if we don't meet a nor'wester in passing the Faroes. Are you not subject to considerable delays?" "No, Lidenbrock. Don't be uneasy. We shall get there in very good time." At evening the schooner doubled the score at the northern point of Denmark. In the night passed the Skagerrak, skirted Norway by Cape Lindness, and entered the North Sea. In 2 days more we sighted the coast of Scotland, near Peterhead, and the Valkyra turned her lead towards the Faroe Islands, passing between Orkneys and Shetlands. Soon the schooner encountered the great Atlantic swell. She had to tack against the north wind, and reached the Faroes only with some difficulty. On the 8th the captain made out Magennis, the southernmost of these islands, and from that moment took a straight course for Cape Portland, the most southerly point of Iceland. The passage was marked by nothing unusual. I bore the troubles of the sea pretty well. My uncle, to his own intense disgust and his greater shame, was ill all through the voyage. He therefore was unable to converse with the captain about Snaefell, the way to get to it, the facilities for transport. He was obliged to put off these inquiries until his arrival, and spent all his time at full length in his cabin, of which the timbers creaked and shook with every pitch she took. I must be confessed he was not undeserving of his punishment. On the 11th we reached Cape Portland. The clear, open weather gave us good view of the Madrels Jokul, which overhangs it. The cape is merely a low hill with steep sides, standing lonely by the beach. The Valkyra kept some distance from the coast, taking a westerly course amidst great shoals of whales and sharks. Soon we came in sight of an enormous perforated rock, through which the sea dashed furiously. The Westman islets seemed to rise out of the ocean like a group of rocks in a liquid plain. From that time the schooner took a wide berth and swept at a great distance round Cape Rekenjes, which forms the western point of Iceland. The rough sea prevented my uncle from coming on deck to admire these shattered, surf-beaten coasts. 48 hours after coming out of a storm which forced the schooner to scud under bare poles, we sighted east of us the beacon on Cape Skagen, where dangerous rocks extended far away seaward. The Icelandic pilot came on board, and in 3 hours the Valkyra dropped her anchor before Reykjavik in Faxa Bay. The professor at last emerged from his cabin, rather pale and wretched-looking, but still full of enthusiasm, with the ardent satisfaction shining in his eyes. The population of the town, wonderfully interested in the arrival of a vessel from which everyone expected something, formed in groups along the quay. My uncle left in haste his floating prison, or rather hospital. But before quitting the deck of the schooner, he dragged me forward, and pointing with an outstretched finger north of the bay at a distant mountain terminating in a double peak, a pair of cones covered with perpetual snow, he cried, "Snaefell! Snaefell!" Then, recommending me by an impressive gesture to keep silence, he went into the boat which awaited him. I followed, and presently we were treading the soil of Iceland. The first man we saw was a good-looking fellow enough in a general's uniform. Yet he was not a general, but a magistrate, the governor of the island, M. le Baron Trempe himself. The professor was soon aware of the presence he was in. He delivered him his letters from Copenhagen, and then followed a short conversation in the Danish language, the purport of which I was quite ignorant of, and for very good reason. But the result of this first conversation was that Baron Trempe placed himself entirely at the service of Professor Lidenbrock. My uncle was just as courteously received by the mayor, M. Finson, whose appearance was military and disposition and office as specific as the governor's. As for the bishop's suffragan, M. Peterson, he was at the moment engaged in an episcopal visitation in the north. For the time we must be resigned to wait for the honour of being presented to him. But M. Fredrickson, professor of natural sciences at the School of Ravignac, was a delightful man, and his friendship became very precious to me. The modest philosopher spoke only Danish and Latin. He came to proffer me his good offices in the language of Horace, and I felt we were made to understand each other. In fact, he was the only person in Iceland with whom I could converse at all. This good-natured gentleman made over to us 2 of the 3 rooms which his house contained, and we were soon installed in it with all of our luggage, the abundance of which rather astonished the good people of Ravignac.
"Well, Axel," said my uncle, "we are getting on, and now the worst is over."
"Worst?" I said, astonished.
"To be sure. Now we have nothing to do but go down."
"Oh, if that is all, you are quite right. But after all, when we have gone down, we shall have to get up again, I suppose."
"Oh, I don't trouble myself about that. Come, there's no time to lose. I am going to the library. Perhaps there is some manuscript of Skenassum's there, and I should be glad to consult it."
"Well, while you are there, I will go into the town, won't you?"
"Oh, that is very uninteresting to me. It is not what is upon this island, but what is underneath that interests me."
I went out, and wandered wherever chance took me. It would not be easy to lose your way in Ravignac. I was therefore under no necessity to inquire the road, which exposes to one mistakes when the only medium of intercourse is gesture. The town extends along a low and marshy level between 2 hills. An immense bed of lava bounds it on one side, and falls gently towards the sea. On the other extends a vast bay of Faxa, shut in at the north by an enormous glacier of the Snaefell, and of which the Vouchsafed was for the time the only occupant. Usually the English and the French conservators of fisheries moor in this bay, but just then they were cruising about the western coasts of the island. The longest of the 2 streets that Ravignac possesses was parallel with the beach. Here live the merchants and traders in wood cabins made of red planks set horizontally. The other street, running west, ends at the little lake between the house of the bishop and other non-commercial people. I had soon explored these melancholy ways. Here and there I got a glimpse of faded turf, looking like a worn-out bit of carpet, or some appearance of a kitchen garden, the sparse vegetables of which, potatoes, cabbages, and lettuces, would have figured appropriately upon a Lilliputian table. A few sickly wallflowers were trying to enjoy the air and sunshine. About the middle of the tin commercial street I found the public cemetery, enclosed with a mud wall, and where there seemed plenty of room. Then a few steps brought me to the governor's house, a butt compared with the town hall of Hamburg, a palace in comparison with the cabins of the Icelandic population. Between the little lake and the town, the church is built in the Protestant style, of calcined stones extracted out of the volcanoes by their own labour and at their own expense. In high westerly winds it was manifest that the red tiles of the roof would be scattered in the air, to the great danger of the faithful worshippers. On a neighbouring hill I perceived the National School, where, as I was informed later by our host, were taught Hebrew, French, English, and Danish, 4 languages of which, with shame I confess it, I do not know a single word. After an examination, I should have had to stand, last of the 40 scholars educated at this little college. I should have been held unworthy to sleep along with them in one of those little double closets, where more delicate youth would have died of suffocation the very first night. In 3 hours I had seen not only the town, but its environs. The general aspect was wonderfully dull, no trees and scarcely any vegetation. Everywhere bare rocks, sign of volcanic action. The Icelandic huts were made of earth and turf, and the walls slope inwards. They rather resemble roofs placed on the ground, but then these roofs are meadows of comparative fertility. Thanks to the internal heat, the grass grows on them to some degree of perfection. It is carefully mown in the hay season. If it is not, the horses would come to pasture on these green abodes. In my excursion I met but few people. On returning to the main street I found the greater part of the population busied in drying, salting, and putting on board codfish, their chief export. The men looked like robust but heavy, blond Germans with pensive eyes, conscious of being far removed from their fellow creatures. Poor exiles relegated to this land of ice, poor creatures who should have been Inuit, since nature had condemned them to live only just outside the Arctic Circle. In vain did I try to detect a smile upon their lips. Sometimes by spasmodic and involuntary contraction of the muscles they seemed to laugh, but they never smiled. Their costume consisted of a coarse jacket of black woolen cloth, called in Scandinavian lands a vadmel, a hat with a very broad brim, trousers with narrow edge of red, and a bit of leather rolled around the foot for shoes. The women looked as sad and resigned as the men. Their faces were agreeable but expressionless, and they wore gowns and petticoats of dark vadmel. As maidens they wore over their braided little hair knitted brown caps. When married, they put around their heads a coloured handkerchief crowned with a peak of white linen. After a good walk I returned to M. Fredrickson's house, where I found my uncle already in his host's company. Chapter 10. Interesting Conversations with Icelandic Savants. Dinner was ready. Professor Lidenbrock devoured his portion voraciously, for his compulsory fast on board had converted his stomach into a vast, unfathomable gulf. There was nothing remarkable about the meal in itself, but the hospitality of our host, more Danish than Icelandic, reminded me of the heroes of old. It was evident that we were more at home here than he was himself. Conversation was carried on in the vernacular tongue which my uncle mixed with German and M. Fredrickson with Latin for my benefit. It turned upon scientific questions, as befits philosophers, but Professor Lidenbrock was excessively reserved, and at every sentence spoke to me with his eyes, adjoining the most absolute silence upon our plans. In the first place, M. Fredrickson wanted to know what success my uncle had at the library. "Your library? Why, there is nothing there but a few tattered books upon almost deserted shelves." "Indeed!" replied M. Fredrickson. "Why, we possess 8,000 volumes, many of them valuable and scarce, works in the old Scandinavian language, and we have all the novelties that Copenhagen sends us every year." "Where do you keep your 8,000 volumes, for my part?" "Oh, M. Lidenbrock, they are all over the country. In this icy region we are fond of study. There is not a farmer nor a fisherman that cannot read and does not read. Our principle is, that books, instead of growing mouldy behind iron gratings, should be worn out under the eyes of many readers. Therefore these volumes are passed from one to another, read over and over, referred to again and again, and it often happens that they find their way back to their shelves only after an absence of a year or two." "And in the meantime," my uncle said rather spitefully, "strangers!" "Well, what would you have? Foreigners have their libraries at home, and the first essential for labouring people is that they should be educated.
I repeat to you, the love of reading runs in Icelandic blood. In 1816 we founded a prosperous literary society. Learned strangers think themselves honoured in becoming members of it. It publishes books which educate our fellow countrymen and do the country a great service. If you will consent to being a corresponding member, Herr Lidenbrock, you will be giving us great pleasure. My uncle, who had already joined about 100 learned societies, accepted with a grace which evidently touched M. Frederickson. Now, said he, you will be kind enough to tell me what books you hope to find in our library, and I may perhaps enable you to consult them. My uncle's eyes and mine met. He hesitated. This direct question went to the root of the matter, but after a moment's reflection he decided on speaking. Monsieur Frederickson, I wish to know if amongst your ancient books you possess any of the works of Arni Skanasum. Arni Skanasum, replied the Revignac professor. You mean the learned 16th century savant, a naturalist, a chemist, and a traveller? Just so. Glories of Icelandic literature and science? That's the man. An illustrious man anywhere. Quite so. Whose courage was equal to his genius. I see that you know him well. My uncle was bathed in delight at hearing his hero thus described. He feasted his eyes upon M. Frederickson's face. Well, he cried, where are his works? His works? We have them not. What, not in Iceland? They are neither in Iceland nor anywhere else. Why is that? Because Arni Skanasum was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his books were burned by the hands of the common hangman. Very good. Excellent, cried my uncle, to the great scandal of the professor of natural history. What? He cried. Yes, yes, now it is all clear, now it is all unravelled, and I see why Skanasum put into the Index Expurgatorius, and compelled to hide the discoveries made by his genius, was obliged to bury it in an incomprehensible cryptogram, the secret. What secret? Asked M. Frederickson, starting. Oh, just a secret which, my uncle stammered. Have you some private document in your possession? Asked our host. No, I was only supposing a case. Oh, very well, answered M. Frederickson, who was kind enough not to pursue the subject when he noticed the embarrassment of his friend. I hope you will not leave our island until you have seen some of its mineralogical wealth. Certainly, replied my uncle, but I am rather late, or have not others been here before me? Yes, Herr Lidenbrock, the labours of M. Olufsen and Polversen, pursued by the order of the king. The researches of Troil the scientific mission of M. Guimard and Robert on the French corvette. And lately the observations of scientific men who came in the Ravine Hortense have added materially to our knowledge of Iceland. But I assure you, there is plenty left. Do you think so? Said my uncle, pretending to look very modest, and trying to hide the curiosity that was flashing out of his eyes. Oh, yes. How many mountains, glaciers, and volcanoes there are to study, which are as yet but imperfectly known. Then, without going any further, that mountain in the horizon, that is Snæfell. Ah, said my uncle as coolly as he was able. Is that Snæfell? Yes, one of the most curious volcanoes, and the crater of which has scarcely ever been visited. Is it extinct? Oh, yes, more than 500 years. Well, my uncle replied, who was frantically locking his legs together to keep himself from jumping up in the air. That is where I mean to begin my geological studies, there on that Snæfell. What did you call it? Snæfell, replied the excellent M. Frederickson. This part of the conversation was in Latin. I had understood every word of it, and I could hardly conceal my amusement at seeing my uncle try to keep down the excitement and satisfaction which were brimming over in every limb and every feature. He had tried hard to put on an innocent little expression of simplicity, but it looked like a diabolical grin. Yes, said he, your words decide me. We shall try to scale that Snæfell. Perhaps we may even pursue our studies in its crater. I am very sorry, said M. Fredrickson, that my engagements will not allow me to absent myself, or I would have accompanied you myself with both pleasure and profit. Oh, no, no, my uncle replied with great animation. We would not disturb anyone for the world, M. Fredrickson. Still, I thank you with all my heart. The company of such a talented man would have been very serviceable, but the duties of your profession. I am glad to think that our host, in the innocence of his Icelandic soul, was blind to the transparent artifices of my uncle. Very much approve of your beginning with that volcano, M. Lidenbrock. You will gather a harvest of interesting observations. But tell me, how do you expect to get to the peninsula of Snæfell? Sea, crossing the bay. That's the most direct way. No doubt, but it is impossible. Why? Because we don't possess a single boat in Ravignac? Don't mean to say so. You will have to go by land, following the shore. It will be longer, but more interesting. Very well, then. And now I shall have to see about a guide. I have one to offer you. A safe, intelligent man. Yes, an inhabitant of that peninsula. He is an eiderdown hunter, and very clever. He speaks Danish perfectly. When can I see him? Tomorrow, if you like. Why not today? Because he won't be here until tomorrow. Tomorrow, then, added my uncle with a sigh. This momentous conversation ended in a few minutes, with warm acknowledgments paid by the German to the Icelandic professor. At this dinner, my uncle had just elicited important facts, amongst others, the history of Skanasum, the reason for the mysterious document, that his host would not accompany him in his expeditions, and that the very next day a guide would be waiting upon him. Chapter 11. A Guide Found to the Center of the Earth. In the evening I took a short walk on the beach, and returned at night to my plank bed, where I slept soundly all night. When I awoke, I heard my uncle talking at a great rate in the next room. I immediately dressed and joined him. He was conversing in the Danish language with a tall man of robust build. This fine fellow must have been possessed of great strength. His eyes, set in a large and ingenuous face, seemed to me very intelligent. They were of a dreamy sea blue. Long hair, which would have been called red even in England, fell in long meshes upon his broad shoulders. The movements of this native were lithe and supple, but he made little use of his arms in speaking, like a man who knew nothing or cared nothing about the language of gestures. His whole appearance bespoke perfect calmness and self-possession, not indolence, but tranquillity. It was felt at once that he would be beholden to nobody, that he worked for his own convenience, and that nothing in this world could astonish or disturb his philosophic calmness. I caught the shades of this Icelander's character by the way in which he listened to the impassioned flow of words which fell from the professor. He stood with arms crossed, perfectly unmoved by my uncle's incessant gesticulations. A negative was expressed by slow movement of the head from left to right, an affirmative by a slight bend, so slight that his long hair scarcely moved. He carried economy of motion even to parsimony. Certainly, I should never have dreamt, in looking at this man, that he was a hunter. He did not look likely to frighten his game, nor did he seem as if he would even get near it. But the mystery was explained when M. Fredrickson informed me that this tranquil personage was only a hunter of the eider-duck, whose underplumage constitutes the chief wealth of the island. This is the celebrated eider-down, and it requires no great rapidity of movement to get it. Early in the summer, the female, a very pretty bird, goes to build her nest among the rocks of the fjords, with which the coast is fringed. After building the nest, she feathers it with the down plucked from her own breast. Immediately the hunter, or rather the trader, comes and robs the nest, and the female recommences her work. This goes on as long as she has any down left. When she has stripped herself bare, the male takes its turn to pluck himself. But as the course and hard plumage of the male has no commercial value, the hunter does not take the trouble to rob the nest of this. The female therefore lays her eggs in the spoils of her mate. The young are hatched, and the next year harvest begins again. Now, as the eider-duck does not select steep cliffs for her nest, but rather the smooth terraced rocks which slope to the sea, the Icelandic hunter might exercise his calling without any inconvenient exertion. He was a farmer who was not obliged either to sow or reap his harvest, but merely to gather it in. This grave, phlegmatic individual was called Hans Bielke, and he came recommended by M. Fredrickson. He was our future guide. His manners were singular contrast with my uncle's. Nevertheless, they soon came to understand each other. Neither looked at the amount of payment. The one was ready to accept whatever was offered, the other was ready to give whatever was demanded. Never was a bargain more readily concluded. The result of the treaty was that Hans engaged on his part to conduct us to the village of Stepai, on the south shore of Snæfell Peninsula, at the very foot of the volcano. By land, this would be about 22 miles, to be done, said my uncle, in 2 days. But when he learnt that a Danish mile was 24,000 feet long, he was obliged to modify his calculations and allow 7 or 8 days for the march. 4 horses were to be placed at our disposal, 2 to carry him and me, and 2 for the baggage. Hans, as was his custom, would go on foot. He knew all that part of the coast perfectly, and promised to take us there the shortest way. His engagement was not to terminate with our arrival at Stepai. He was to continue in my uncle's service for the whole period of his scientific researches, for the remuneration of 3 riksdaler a week, about 12 shillings. But it was an express article of the covenant that his wage should be counted out to him every Saturday at 6 o'clock in the evening, which, according to him, was one indispensable part of the engagement. The start was fixed for the 16th of June. My uncle wanted to pay the hunter a portion in advance, but he refused with one word. "Efter," said he. "After," said the professor, for my edification. The treaty concluded, Hans silently withdrew. "A famous fellow!" cried my uncle, "but he little thinks of the marvellous part he has to play in the future." "So he is to go with us as far as—" "As far as the centre of the earth, Axel." 48 hours were left before our departure. To my great regret I had to employ them in preparations, for all our ingenuity was required to pack every article to the best advantage, instruments here, arms there, tools in this package, provisions in that, 4 sets of packages in all. The instruments were an Eggel's centigrade thermometer, graduated up to 150 degrees, which seemed to me too much or too little. Too much if the internal heat was to rise so high, for in this case we should be baked. Not enough to measure the temperature of springs or any matter in this state of fusion. An aneroid barometer, to indicate the extreme pressures of the atmosphere. An ordinary barometer would not have answered the purpose, as the pressure would increase during our descent to a point where a miracle barometer would not register. A chronometer, made by Bosonus Jun of Geneva, accurately set to the meridian of Hamburg. 2 compasses, a common compass and a dipping needle. A night glass. 2 Ramakof's apparatus, which, by means of an electric current, supplied a safe and handy portable light. The arms consisted of 2 Purdy's rifles and 2 brace of pistols. But what did we want arms for? We had no wild beasts to fear, I supposed. But my uncle seemed to believe in his arsenal as in his instruments, and more especially in a considerable quantity of gun cotton, which is unaffected by moisture, and the explosive force of which exceeds that of gunpowder. The tools comprised of 2 pickaxes, 2 spades, a silk rope ladder, 3 iron-tipped sticks, a hatchet, a hammer, a dozen wedges and iron spikes, and a long knotted rope. Now this was a large load, for the ladder was 300 feet long. And there were provisions too. This was not a large parcel, but it was comforting to know that the essence of beef and biscuits there were 6 months' consumption. Spirits were the only liquid, and of water we took none, but we had flasks, and my uncle depended on springs from which to fill them. Whatever objections I hazarded as to their quality, temperature, and even absence remained ineffectual.
To complete the exact inventory of all our travelling accompaniments, I must not forget a pocket medicine chest containing blunt scissors, splints for broken limbs, a piece of tape of unbleached linen, bandages and compresses, lint, a lancet for bleeding, all dreadful articles to take with one. Then there was a row of vials containing dextrotine, alcohol ether, liquid acetate of lead, vinegar, and ammonia drugs which afforded me no comfort. Finally, all the articles needful to supply Rimakoff's apparatus. My uncle did not forget a supply of tobacco, coarse-grained powder, and amaru, nor a leathern belt which he carried a sufficient quantity of gold, silver, and paper money. 6 pairs of boots and shoes, made waterproof with a composition of india rubber and naphtha, were packed among the tools.
Clothed, shod, and equipped like this, said my uncle, there's no telling how far we may go.
The 14th was wholly spent in arranging all our different articles. In the evening we dined with Baron Tramps, the Mayor of Ravignac, and Dr. Hillerton, the first medical man of the place, being of the party. M. Frederickson was not there. I learned afterwards that he and the governor disagreed upon some question of administration and did not speak to each other. I therefore knew not a single word of all that was said at this semi-official dinner, but I could not help noticing that my uncle talked the whole time. On the 15th our preparations were all made. Our host gave the professor very great pleasure by presenting him with a map of Iceland far more complete than that of Henderson. It was the map of M. Olaf Nicholson Olsen, in the proportion of 1 to 480,000 of the actual size of the island, and published by the Icelandic Literary Society. It was a precious document for a mineralogist. Our last evening was spent in intimate conversation with M. Frederickson, with whom I felt the liveliest sympathy, then after the talk, succeeded for me at any rate at a disturbed and restless night. At 5 in the morning I was awoke by the neighing and pawing of 4 horses under my window. I dressed hastily and came down into the street. Hans was finishing our packing, almost as it were without moving a limb, and yet he did his work cleverly. My uncle made more noise than execution, and the guide seemed to pay very little attention to his energetic directions. At 6 o'clock our preparations were over. M. Frederickson shook hands with us. My uncle thanked him heartily for his extreme kindness. I constructed a few fine Latin sentences to express my cordial farewell. Then we bestrode our steeds, and with the last adieu M. Frederickson treated me to a vine of Virgil, eminently applicable to such uncertain wanderers as we were likely to be. Et quecum queviem dedent fortuna sequamur. Therever fortune clears a way, thither our ready footsteps stray. That concludes our tale for this week, my friend. Please return next week and we will continue our journey through The Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. If you wish to rest some more, please find a space that suits you, whether you curl up by the fire, partake in some food and beverages in our kitchen, take a nap in one of our many rooms, or take a stroll around the garden. Please know you are always welcome at Sniper's Rest, my friend. If you are continuing your journey, the multiverse has some interesting twists and turns for you today. To the north, the year is 2052 and life is very different. Drugs, disease, and pollution kill thousands, the world's economies are collapsing, and an organization hell-bent on world domination emerges from the shadows to take advantage of the chaos. All in a day's work, right? To the west, the aliens never learn their lesson. In this rude, crude world, battle your way through the worst humanity has to offer while killing aliens with a big-ass gun. Time to bring the pain. To the east, it's 2051 and Earth is no longer the same place. Consumed by rising oceans and expanding deserts, the population is thrown into widespread famine and poverty. Water is now humans' most precious of things, and people will absolutely kill to get it. Welcome to the fight, engineer. And if you're making your own way out there, good luck, my friend, wherever you end up. Wherever you come from and wherever you're going, thank you for spending some time here with us at Sniper's Rest. Remember to take care of yourself, be kind to others, hydrate, take a moment to look out into the world and marvel at how incredible it all is. How incredible you are, friend. Until next time, please take care on your way.